An already famous poet is working for the first time on something light and fun. It's a children's book of poems about cats. All his previous work has basically been about the anxious terror in the modern world. But this time it's going to be something delightful for a change. His dad likes cats. He likes cats. He has friends who have kids who like cats. This is a book about cats. He's a handful of lines in when he stops himself. He's writing about a female cat, a fallen star, and he decides not to go on. This super educated man realizes that, probably unconsciously, he's modeling his character study after something that has been done before, albeit centuries earlier and in another language. The risk of plagiarism doesn't stop him. He just realizes that this story is too sad to go into a book that is designed to entertain kids. Those poems are finished and eventually read on the radio on Christmas Day in 1937 to a delighted English audience, and one of the youngsters who hears them is Andrew Lloyd Webber, who will go on to become what can safely be called the most powerful force on Broadway. He turns the poems into a musical, and with the help of T.S. Eliot's widow Valerie, he combines the figure with some other poetry that Eliot wrote to create the character Grizabella, produce the song Memory, and that will become absolutely iconic. Now, T.S. Eliot pointedly did not sexualize the characters in his poems. Critics would write that Andrew Lloyd Webber's production team would go out of their way not to say anything sexual about Grizabella or her past, and yet, today, those who write about the character the most closely argue convincingly that she is widely understood to be a former prostitute. And she is, just not in any English language version. Why is she understood this way when there's no reference to prostitution in the text for the musical, and when she doesn't even appear in the original book of poetry at all? Doesn't matter? And if so, why? We will trace those rumors on this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. So, a little bookkeeping. We're going to have an interstitial episode on Phantom of the Opera. There's an entire series on the Phantom. I think that's episodes 4, 5, and 6. And that follows the overall pattern of this podcast, where we start with the original book and end with the musical with some speculation about why it was so successful. The new episode that's going to come right after we finish up here with Cats is going to do something that is both novel and obvious. I asked some listeners what makes the show work for them as audience members. Now, I thought that would be pretty straightforward, but let me just say that the Dirk Gently "It Is All Connected" edict did not let us down. And there are some amazing connections and overlaps that I found to be totally awesome, and I hope that you will too. That is going to come up after these Cats episodes. As always, your listening to these tales really makes what I put into them worthwhile. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We're doing well enough that we're about to launch a serious marketing push. My goal is to make the show viable and self-sustaining. But far more than what I do, what you all do is likely to determine whether or not we can survive past the 1-year mark, which is coming up in August. So if you can like this, share it, dump it on your social media someplace. If you find an episode that you like, give it a rating, especially on Amazon, Apple, or Spotify, or just wherever you listen to it, and drop me a line just to let me know that you're listening, you're downloading. It does mean a lot. Okay, we have already reviewed T.S. Eliot, the author who originally wrote the Cats poems, and we've traced that through the show and how the show came about, which, as always, includes a discussion of why I think the show works. In a nutshell, and there's, of course, a lot more to it than this, it is a show that is light on plot, but heavy on sex and theater spectacle. And I'm not just sliding that sex part in. There is more than one author and critic who think that cats are sexy, or at least the way the cats are performed is sexy, and that sexiness is a big part of the success of the show. Oh, and we've also made a few side trips into T.S. Eliot and his relation to the occult. If you like the mystery and supernatural part of this podcast, Cats has the least far to stretch to get to the spirit world. Their academic papers with titles like, quote, T.S. Eliot and the occult, end quote. Anyway, that has occupied the recent attention of this podcast. We are now down to 2 strains of inquiry that remain around the production. The one we'll get to next time involves the failures of Cats. It is, of course, one of the most successful musicals of all time and maybe one of the biggest and most lucrative entertainment projects of all time, but it has forayed into a few can't-miss extensions of its franchise that missed badly. Figuring out why that happened will be what we take up in our next episode, but today's topic is about Grizabella, the glamour cat who's fallen from grace, or maybe fame, or maybe limelights, or maybe prostitution. Part of the most interesting thing about this question is, why is it even a question? So let's start with where Grizabella came from, and then we'll talk about what it's like to be a prostitute, and then we'll talk about why there is a debate about whether or not Grizabella is a prostitute. And as always, we will try to land on what does this tell us as a lesson for theater or for life, or both. Okay, so where did Grizabella come from? Well, she is not in the original T.S. Eliot book. If you're rewind to the start of this series, which I think started at episode 15, you will discover that T.S. Eliot was a very serious modernist poet. He wrote a very grim and a dark poem called The Wasteland. That was really the poem that launched him. He wrote more dark and serious stuff, and he eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature much later in life, again writing very serious stuff, although the later stuff was a little more hopeful. No one would say it was fun and cheery and light. More than just about anyone else, he ushered in the modernist movement in literature, and it's pretty disturbing. The writing is concerned with industrial warfare, human alienation, a loss of faith, and a general ennui about society and humanity in general. He also had a troubling anti-Semitic streak, which was pretty much out in the open, and his best friend was Ezra Pound, who is racist in all the ways that one can be, up to the point where he signed on with the Mussolini government, was taken prisoner as a collaborator when Italy fell to the Allies, and not just a collaborator, like he was having dinner with Mussolini and doing all he could to advance the Italian fascist cause. And then, right in the middle of all that going on in his life, he wrote a delightful little book of children's poems about cats. It was called Old Possum's Guide to Practical Cats. And the only mark of any serious connection with anything is that Old Possum is a nickname that a virulent racist Ezra Pound gave to T.S. Eliot. And that nickname came from The Song of the South, a group of stories so racist that Disney had to shutter the movie that they made under that title. But other than that, it does just seem to be a fun book about poems about cats. The stories started in correspondence that he'd had with friends and the children of friends, and they really did just seem like a guy who liked cats and liked chatting with others about cats and inventing in his own brilliant mind this elaborate world where cats were and categorizing different cats in different ways. Grizabella is nowhere in that book. He did start a poem about a cat named Grizabella, but then he scrapped it. He both thought that the character he was developing was too sad for children, as I mentioned earlier, and also that it was derivative of a 1500s poem by a poet named Villon. The specific poem in question is about a woman who laments the loss of youth and beauty, and even laments the loss of an abusive spouse, as in, she acknowledges the abuse, but not only still wishes that he'd come back, but she kind of knows that if he does come back, he'll abuse her some more, but that's still okay with her because love or devotion or something. Anyway, it didn't age well, but if there is a historical Grizabella, it is La Belle Ulmière by Villon, and this entire thing is in the transcript. I'm, as usual, butchering the words in French. Okay, but it is also probably not that character either because, and I'm repeating myself here, that character is not in the book. Grizabella is in the musical because T.S. Eliot's widow, Valerie Eliot, saw a workshop performance of what Andrew Lloyd Webber was working on. She turned over an unfinished poem to Andrew Lloyd Webber and his crew, including director Trevor Nunn, and they added the bit about the Jellicle cats having a ball to pick who got to go to the Heaviside layer. Then they took the poem scraps, combined it with another poem that Eliot had written called Rhapsody on a Windy Night, and then created the character Grizabella and the song Memory, both of which were enormously successful. Which is a long road that winds us back to this thought. If Grizabella is a prostitute, that's something that got created for the musical because it is definitely not in the book. T.S. Eliot pointedly made the decision not to finish the poem and not to include it in his book of poems about cats. The second bit of background context that's probably important to understanding Grizabella is the nature of prostitution itself. As I think I've mentioned before on this show, I helped develop a class on sexual communication, and I'm a co-author of a book on the topic, so I feel safe in saying that there are two basic academic approaches to prostitution. The overarching motif for sexual values is that males should be sexual initiators and females should be the gatekeeper. This results in expectations that males will always want sex with any attractive female and generally pursue those relationships, while females will be careful in the selection of their sexual partners. Partially, this might have some biological basis since women are far more likely to get pregnant than men and are also more susceptible to sexually transmitted infections. Anyway, there's a lot more at risk for a woman who's having unprotected sex. But that's only a small part of it. And most of the whole initiator gatekeeper thing is a huge social construction. We've talked about what that means earlier in the show, but let's just say it's a societal norm. And not a very controversial one. Most academics writing about this identify the male initiator, female gatekeeper idea is pretty prevalent in at least U.S. culture. The end result is some massive double standards that I don't have to tell the female listeners of this show about. In particular, males who have a lot of sex with a lot of different people are considered excellent initiators, and most of the slang terms for sexually prolific males are positive. In sharp contrast, females who have sex with lots of different people are considered very poor gatekeepers, and all the slang terms for females who freely have sex with many partners are almost all negative. There are, of course, nuances that I'm brushing over here, but let's just say that there isn't too much controversy around whether there are double standards in Western culture. And I'm using the term Western here informally for those of you who have read Edward Said, but let's just say in the US and UK culture, this is pretty standard stuff. Now, that double standard is especially bad for prostitutes. The research evidence pretty conclusively proves that only a tiny percentage of prostitutes are in the profession voluntarily. That is, they have viable other choices and they've decided they just like being prostitutes. Many are simply and literally enslaved by organized crime and sex traffickers. Others don't really have any other economic opportunity. And if you made a pie chart of all the prostitutes in the world and why they were doing it, the group of, quote, had plenty of other economic opportunities and weren't coerced, but freely chose prostitution because they just enjoyed the lifestyle, end quote, that would be the tiniest slice of that pie by a lot, and you'd probably have to squint to see it. And even then, there is research to show that there are a host of negative physical and psychological outcomes that affect those engaged in prostitution, even if they report that they are doing it voluntarily. So, the sexual double standard is nowhere more ironic and unfair than it is with prostitution, where people, mostly women, are forced into doing unpleasant things and horrible things that they don't really want to do at the cost of their bodily autonomy and physical and mental health, but are still massively stigmatized because they are negatively and harshly judged as bad sexual gatekeepers. All of these themes, of course, are developed in great depth in Victor Hugo's masterpiece, Les Miserables. What's it like to be a prostitute? You are forced into giving your body over to others to do with as they wish and are then harshly judged by society as being a moral failure for doing so. There are double standards, and then there are tragedies, and this is way closer to full-on tragedy. The academic world, as I said, has two different approaches to this. One is to celebrate paid sex workers. And people in this group would point out that they are subject to a number of awful stereotypes based on those double standards. This group would like society to get over its sexual hangups, to treat sex as a natural thing that humans do, to stop stigmatizing those who do sex work, to decriminalize it, to improve the working conditions of those who do work in the sex industry, including the pornographic film workers, exotic dancers, and prostitutes, and eliminate the double standards by legitimizing sex work and empowering those who engage in it. That is the first approach. The second approach is to attack the stigma, to point to prostitutes as victims rather than criminals, to offer greater protections, crack down more on those who sex traffic, and criminalize and prosecute male pimps and male customers at least as much as they prosecute the prostitutes. I'm sure you've already thought of 2 or 3 points for and against each of these stances, and I'm not going to pick, although I will add that it all seems to turn on how much you think negative physical and psychological outcomes are the same, even if prostitution is voluntary. Which gets us back to Grizabella. If she is a formerly glamorous performer and maybe an attractive, sexy one, then you could read the song Memory as a lament for the loss of her status as her beauty and her fame faded. If you read her as a former prostitute, then the double standard immediately splashes over that character. She's a fallen woman. She's morally corrupt. She was given to partying and loose sex and moral depravity, who is now suffering the consequences of her immoral lifestyle and her bad choices. Think of the slang terms you hear applied to prostitutes, apply them to Grizabella, and that's what happens to the character when she is thought of as a prostitute and not as a former stage star. So whether or not Grizabella is a former prostitute changes quite a bit the interpretation of the character in the show. And there's a pretty direct biblical connection between Jesus and his treatment of prostitutes, Luke chapter 7, Matthew chapter 21, and I guess Grizabella going to the heaviside layer. Jesus said that there would be prostitutes who would get into heaven before some of the religious leaders. And right here, in this show, we can watch a prostitute ascend into heaven before everyone else. If indeed Grizabella is a prostitute, and if indeed the heaviside layer is heaven, then that's what it probably means. If she's a famous ex-star who's lost her popularity, her youth, and her beauty, then she's like kind of an abandoned Great Gatsby whose hangers-on have abandoned her now that she can no longer fund the party. And of course, there's the titillation. If she's a prostitute, the audience can kind of snicker at her a little bit more thanks to the societal sexual double standards. So our main question, is Grizabella a prostitute? Well, not in Eliot's original and unfinished poems. There's no mention of a Grizabella being a prostitute in the Cat script either. At all. Just go to the local library and check out their copy of the libretto. That's a fancy term that I just learned means a full copy of the dialogue and the lyrics, and see if you can find any reference to it. If there is anything that talks about her past sexual identity, it's done in innuendo. Even if there's even that, I'm not sure that there is, or I'm pretty sure there's not. And yet, Grizabella is thought of as a prostitute. That's casually mentioned in discussions of the various reviews and the revivals and the commentary that surround this massively popular show. For example, Asia Romano writes for Vox and was a 2019 fellow for the National Critics Institute. So they've got some chops as a theater critic. And in 2019 article, they wrote this selection, quote, "Then there's the backstory for Grizabella, Jennifer Hudson's once glamorous dance cat who's now, a fallen cat prostitute. I told you cats are weird. The details regarding Grizabella's journey from celebrated performer to sex worker have never been clear in any version, but in the film they're made even more bizarre. That's because another cat, McCavity, played by Idris Elba, is now somehow her pump and her catnip pusher. So instead of just having to accept cat sex workers, we have to accept an entire feline underground of sex and drug trafficking." And, quote, that's, of course, talking about the 2019 movie, which was the CGI version that did not fare well. We'll talk about that movie in the next episode. But for now, just note how unequivocally Grizabella is accepted as a prostitute. That idea that she's a prostitute did not appear out of nowhere in the 2019 movie. It had been in the cultural milieu for quite a while since then. And you'll find much, much more on the fan wikis and more than one WordPress site. This Grizabella is a prostitute seems to be one of those things that is untrue, but everyone wants to casually drop to seem like they might have some insight. Oh, Ty Cobb, one of baseball's greatest hitters and earliest stars. He was a mean bastard who killed a disabled man. Not true. And Charles Learson has written a book to prove it. But that hasn't really changed the common perception about Ty Cobb and who he was. Or, how about this one? In the first televised debate, Richard Nixon beat JFK among radio audiences. Also not true, but still widely believed. David Schwimmer, that lovable guy from France, he cheated charities out of millions of dollars. Also not true, but almost impossible for that poor guy to shake. And Richard Gere, there was this gerbil. I'm just going to stop right there. Let's just say that, and I say this as a communication professional, baseless rumors are often given the weight of fact and are really, really hard to shake. Oh yeah, so Grizabella, she was a prostitute. Also not true. Not for T.S. Eliot, not for Andrew Lloyd Webber, not the book poems, and not in the musical script. But Griz is constantly referred to as a prostitute. Why? Well, basically, because of a Japanese mistranslation. And despite what I just said about Grizabella not being a prostitute in the original American production, she definitively is a prostitute in the Japanese production. And here, I'm going to crib heavily from only a single source. David Chandler works at Doshisha University, and he wrote an article titled, "We Are All One Grizabella, Prostitution, Theology, and the Cult of Cats in Japan," which was published in an academic journal called Studies in Musical Theater. Chandler starts with two observations. First, as the German synthpop band Alphaville would have put it, Cats is huge in Japan. By 2006, it had been performed 6,500 times and has only recently been overtaken by The Lion King. Second, The London and Broadway productions were huge tourist events where massive numbers of Japanese people would watch the show. And as we have discussed in previous episodes, the fact that it's not heavily plot-driven made it appealing to non-English speaking audiences for whom the language barrier was less of an issue. In the words of Chandler, quote, "It is possible more seats to see Cats have in fact been bought by the Japanese than any other people," end quote. That makes their audience at least as large as the English-speaking audience. So, what is true of the Japanese production is that it likely is going to have some influence on how the show is understood overall. Chandler reviews the paper-thin case for Elliot ever having considered Grizabella as a prostitute, which includes some vague references by Valerie Elliott and to Valerie Elliott, but it's not that she is a prostitute, but that maybe there was some implication, some of the stuff she said, that there was a character that was based on, might have been a prostitute, but it's pretty clear that whatever is true of her past in the English version, that is Grizabella's past, is implication and innuendo. But not so in the Japanese version. That version removes the specific reference to places in London when they were translating it for the Japanese production, but it unequivocally identified Grizabella as a prostitute in that production. Here's how it all happened, according to Chandler. In 1983, a New York Times reviewer named Stephen Holden was writing about Cats and made a passing mention to the, quote, "ruined prostitute Grizabella," end quote. In 1980, then of course it opens in 1981 in English language theaters, and in 1983 the show was being translated into Japanese, and the translator was someone named Kaita Asari. Asari is the former general director of the Shiki Theater Company who owns the performance rights to the Japanese version of Cats. His translation was influenced by three factors. First, he'd probably seen Holden's comment, and Chandler finds it likely that this was extremely influential. Quote, "As I have personally experienced on hundreds of occasions, the Japanese are extremely, excessively reluctant to trust their own interpretations of an English text and will gratefully and often uncritically seize on any help they can get. They also tend to revere any intellectual authority who has been somewhat institutionally sanctioned, and New York Times critics would certainly fall into that category," end quote. Second, the Shiki Company drew on the work of and actually included in their programs an essay by the scholar Shinsuke Ando of Keio University in Tokyo, where he vigorously argued that T.S. Eliot's work was serious and not light verse. Now, we've talked about that in the past. T.S. Eliot was a very serious academic literary guy, but Cats is not that. And so it's weird that the Cats was interpreted to be such a serious thing. Now, that makes it much more likely that you would then think of Grizabella as a prostitute and not just a former superstar who had fallen from grace. And third, Chandler takes great pains to show that being a prostitute means something very different in Japan than it does in the UK. Chandler writes, quote, "Anyone living in a major Japanese city knows the sex industry is huge, visible, and for the most part tolerated, and any number of commentators have agreed with Stephen Mansfeld that, quote within a quote, no other country in the world offers the sheer variety of sexual services found in Japan, end quote within the quote, back to the quote. Thus, when Asari is writing the translation, Asari presumably reasoned that his audience would accept prostitution non-judgmentally as a basic, albeit shadowy part of the fabric of human life," end quote. So that's what got into the show. In 2007, a theater critic with a journalistic background named Shin Osani, who's now become an associate professor at Shenshu University in Tokyo, wrote a book called Musicals in Progress. Leaning into the belief that the T.S. Eliot work must be profound, he took the stance, like most of Andrew Lloyd Webber's work, Cats was a religious story of ascent. From there, the interpretation gets more and more elaborate, but they all depend on the ascent being religious and Grizabella being a prostitute. Then, and here's another extensive quote from Chandler, quote, "In 2009, a far more significant and influential study appeared in the form of Masayuki Akida's book, Niko Tachi no Butokai, Eliot to Musical Cats, The Ball of the Cats, Eliot and the Musical Cats. It is no exaggeration to say that most Japanese with a special interest in cats now tend to view the musical through the lens of this cheaply priced study," end quote. Those arguments also get so twisted and detailed that rather than outline them, Chandler just includes a 7-paragraph direct quote. I won't even attempt to summarize it all. The references are in the transcript for those of you who are especially cognitively involved and cognitively gifted and have lots of free time, but it also involves Cats as a very serious work. Grizabella's ascent as salvation and rebirth, and adds the dimension of sex as central. And I am now reading directly from the Aikida quote within the Chandler article, quote, "The story of Grizabella's salvation and rebirth in cats is also connected to this nature of human life and sex," end quote. And then a few sentences later, quote, "She has been living through this torn dualism of life and sex," end quote. Anyway, in these interpretations, understanding Grizabella's role in the narrative means accepting that she is both a prostitute and that her sexual nature is crucial to her role overall. In the final flourish, Aikida believes that Eliot intentionally obscured the meaning of his poems, but that Weber and Nunn, quote, "managed the feat of scenting out the poet's religiousness and sense of the tragic flowing through the bottom of the original book and made it into a musical of miracle," quote. Or they were just looking for a good song to anchor the show. But what a great conspiracy. Eliot has deep and hidden sexual content, but doesn't include it in the book in the hopes that his scraps of unfinished poetry would later be combined with finished poetry and mashed together by two other geniuses who understood the critical dualism of life and sex, whatever that is, and decided to put that into a musical where they would also hide the explicit connection so that only super enlightened critics could tease them out. The Da Vinci Code conspiracy is not that complicated, but that is what appears in the book. Chandler reads all this, includes that there is no there. And as you probably can tell from my sarcasm, I pretty much agree with Chandler. And as the kicker, Lloyd Webber, who is sort of a stickler for detail and insistent on retaining control over the touring shows and the foreign language productions, didn't even bother to have the Japanese version of the script back translated so that he could catch the change, had it mattered to him. If Lloyd Webber didn't know that Grizabella had been made into a prostitute in the Japanese version, that kind of kills the Osani and the Aikida interpretations, or at least the really elaborate conspiracy theories. But that cemented the idea of Grizabella as a prostitute in the Japanese rendition, and that rendition was so large and the Japanese audience influential enough that it made a difference in how Grizabella is understood overall. For English language audiences, Chandler quotes Rick Rylance in the year 2000 as saying, quote, "Many professional commentators and thousands of undergraduates call this woman a prostitute for no reason that is explicit in the text," end quote. Chandler himself says, quote, "As more and more critics have described the woman as a prostitute, it has become hard to think of her as anything else, and any new statement of the case can be supported by the older ones," end quote. And then, of course, all that gets made explicit in the 2019 movie. So now we know why Grizabella is thought of as the prostitute. A New York Times reviewer made a side comment that a Japanese translator gave too much credit to. That change was latched onto by serious Japanese scholars and critics, and the entire cultural milieu was such that between when the show first ran in 1981 and when Rick Rylance was writing in 2000, it was widely accepted that Grizabella was a prostitute, just as it is widely accepted that Richard Gere, I'm going to stop there again, neither are true. In fairness to the Japanese audiences, they seem led by some serious literary works that go a little off the rails, which many literary interpretations can do. We've talked about what happens with critical theory in some earlier episodes. It's not all bad, but some of them, it's hard to separate what the critic is making up and what is likely actually the case. But at any rate, the Japanese are less judgy about prostitutes anyway, so there's an additional layer to the character. It's not just a dirty joke. But for the English language audiences, it's probably just a titillating moniker that lets you laugh and sneer a little bit more, probably without reflecting too much on the double standard behind the joke. Now that we know that Grizabella is thought of as a prostitute, we might ask, why does this matter? So what if a character in a plotless romp is a fallen actress or a former prostitute? She's got the show-stopping song, right? And by the end, we're all cheering for her marvelous ascent up the glorious truck tire to the place with a marvelous title, Heaviside Layer, which might be purgatory or hell or something, or probably heaven, or maybe reincarnation. Wait, that doesn't fit any of the far-flung interpretations of the religious ascent theme, but whatever. By the end of the show, she's the star again, and maybe the hero, so it's okay that she's a prostitute. Well, one person who thinks that it matters a lot and that it's not okay is Catherine Lowerre, Lowerre, of Michigan State University, writing in the Journal of Musicological Research. Although the creators of the show describe Grizabella as universal and timeless, Lowerre sees her specifically as female and decidedly Victorian, and that has some implications. Lowerre makes some connections. She sees a connection between Andrew Lloyd Webber, Margaret Thatcher, and a conservative longing to, in the words of Lowerre, quote, revivify an idealized Victorian past, end quote. Now, unlike some of the more obscure crazed critical theories, this might have something to it. T.S. Eliot had a very public turn to conservatism. That's not really in question. Loehr quotes Andrew Lloyd Webber, who said, quote, "I have, you see, a very sort of Victorian work ethic, which means I am constantly looking for things to do which I hadn't tried my hand at before," end quote. Now, that's not exactly saying that he wants to return to a Victorian time, but when Loehr writes, quote, "I find it interesting that at the same time, in their separate but related empires, both Lloyd Webber and Thatcher are reappropriating the word Victorian and constructing it into a positive past," end quote. That doesn't sound so far off, and there are many others who've made the connection between Thatcher and Lloyd Webber and conservatism, and it's a short walk from there to Victorianism. The show is definitely a Victorian show, and T.S. Eliot was definitely down with all of that. Way more than he was down with, like, I'm going to hide the secret sexual content in there. Loehr also points out that the original poetry book is very heavy on males, and that Jenny Anydots is the lone female character with a musical number besides Grizabella, and then points out that another critic named Mantle switches between the use of the words cat and woman when talking about Grizabella, and that doesn't happen when talking about the male characters. And as I've noted in prior episodes, there are those, including cast members, who found more than a faint echo of sexism in the show. It's hard to do things that are both sexy but not sexist in a society with an enormous number of sexual double standards. And the Victorian era was one with very limited roles for women. Loehr writes, quote, in her groundbreaking work, Woman and the Demon, The Life of a Victorian Myth, Nina Auerbach famously argued that, quote within the quote, "The very rigidity of the categories of victim and queen, domestic angel and demonic outcast, old maid and fallen woman concentrates itself into a myth of transfiguration that glorified the women it seemed to suppress," end quote. And I think that's, Loehr is correctly interpreting that to say that even the women who get elevated in those Victorian roles are still constricted by the mere rigidity of the roles. So even the ascent itself isn't exactly a triumph of female empowerment. Quote, "Redemption for Grizabella comes explicitly through the patriarch Deuteronomy and organized religion, not a lover and the promise of heavenly forgiveness," end quote. In fact, quote, "As imagined by Lloyd Webber and Nunn, Grizabella is sick, ostracized, and often absent from view. She is no threat to the social order. Rather, she passionately desires to return to it," end quote. In the end, Grizabella, quote, "functions as a warning to young glamour kittens," end quote, both in the audience and on stage. She's trapped in a trope of the fallen woman taken straight from the Victorian era. And Loehr's point is that it's the very rigidity of the roles, even if you're the queen, that really need to be challenged. Being a fallen woman evokes sympathy, and she gets redeemed by getting back into the same society that rigidly enforced the rules in the first place. Well, that's not really a story of liberation. If it's a story about redemption, it's worth asking what you're getting redeemed into, and the ambiguity of the Heaviside layer makes that one a little tough to untangle. So the twin themes of Grizabella here are that her fall from societal grace is a little problematic. Turning her into a prostitute isn't probably necessary. It's got weird cultural angles. And since English language audiences have so glommed onto the idea, it feels to me like it's a way of applying the sexual double standard when it really doesn't have to be there at all. And second, the redemption of Grizabella is worth asking about since it's not clear where she's going, who's saving her. In the words of Loehr, we see a lot about the machina, but learn very little about the deus. But it is clear that her story is not about challenging the social structures that pushed her out of society in the first place. It's a story about being let back into an essentially unchanged set of rules and roles. And now I don't want this to be a buzzkill about the show. If you love the song and you're cheering for Grizabella, well, so am I, and who doesn't like a good underdog story? But I do think it's worth reflecting on the scholarly debates that have surrounded the show and the character, and it's worth trying to figure out whether this is just a show about some cats or if there's something else there, and if there is, what is it all about? And there's been more of that discussion around Grizabella than about any other character in the show. So what have we learned about theater and about life? Well, mostly what happened to Grizabella's character has given us the occasion to think and talk about prostitution, which is the focal point for both serious sexism and sexual double standards. Prostitution is a place where females are literally reduced to sex objects for men to use for money, all while having to take the moral blame for what's going on. The fact that English audiences have been so ready to accept this interpretation says something troubling about our society, and frankly, it says something that we have to confront and fix and put in our past, whether that means adopting sex-positive approaches to sex work or removing the conditions that force people into prostitution or changing the way we think about sex and sexuality. An important thing to do is, at least in the limited world of theater, to put to death the idea that Grizabella is a former prostitute and move on to interpreting the show and her song without that baggage. That won't crash the heteropatriarchy, but all wars are won a single battle at a time, and this is ultimately a contest of ideas. All right. So we have now reviewed one of the side quests surrounding cats. We figured out what folks have to say about Grizabella. We have one more episode before we leave our gang of cats, and that has to do with the productions of Cats that did not take off. As always, we'll be looking for the lessons for life in theater, both in places where things worked out and where it did not. Our next episode will be broadcast direct from production hell in our next episode of Theater History and Mysteries.